I think our knowledge of cannabis is expanding hugely at the moment, so it's hard to put your finger just on one thing that health workers need to be aware of. I'd say there's several things, and in fact, our ideas about cannabis seem to change quite a lot over time. We definitely are learning a huge amount at the moment. For example, we know a lot more about how cannabis affects the brain. Things that were very mysterious even just 20 years ago are now much better understood in terms of at least the short-term effects of cannabis on the brain. We're also learning more about the long-term effects. So if you're a daily cannabis user, we've got a better idea of how that might affect your brain. And then there's the plant itself. There's actually some remarkable chemistry and botany work going on at the moment where we're learning a lot more about cannabis, the plant. So on all different levels, our knowledge of this remarkable drug is expanding. There's about 80 chemicals in cannabis smoke that are of the cannabinoid family. They have a distinctive chemical structure and they're able to interact with a particular protein in the brain called the cannabinoid receptor. So when you smoke cannabis, there's one of these 80 cannabinoids that seems particularly potent, and that is the compound THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. And it binds to the CB1 receptor and causes a major change in the functioning of the brain. It seems to shut down the activity of some types of neurons and enhance the activity of other types of neurons. So the overall balance of the way the brain operates is greatly influenced by THC. We can see this in brain imaging studies where certain parts of the brain seem to shut down on cannabis while others light up. So it's the ability of THC in the cannabis plant to interact with these cannabinoid receptors in the brain that underlies the main psychoactive actions of cannabis. It's interesting to ponder also how that may have evolved. It could well be that THC is something that plants developed as a defense mechanism. If you're a goat or a sheep that comes along and eats a hemp plant and gets completely intoxicated, then you might think twice about eating that hemp plant in the future. So there's sort of evolutionary questions that I think are quite interesting about how THC developed. I think what's really interesting at the moment is our understanding of the cannabis plant. And we know that there's about 80 of these different cannabinoids in the plant. And up until this point, all the focus has been on THC, which we know is the main psychoactive one. But there's probably 5 or 6 other cannabinoids that are also interacting with the brain. And the race is on at the moment in science to try and unlock the mysteries of what they're doing. One that's got a lot of attention at the moment is cannabidiol, which is CBD. And we know that it kind of modulates the effects of THC in the brain. Some cannabis has a lot of CBD in it, some has hardly any. And it generally seems that if you smoke cannabis that's high in CBD, you get a nicer effect, and maybe there's less vulnerability to things like psychosis or extreme panic in high CBD containing cannabis. So there's a lot of interest now in analysing plant material from different countries to look at relative CBD content. There's also quite good evidence that CBD by itself may be a useful therapeutic. So it may have anti-inflammatory effects, it may interact with adipose tissue, it can have pain-relieving effects, anti-anxiety and antipsychotic effects even. So this may be a new wonder drug for the future. The endogenous cannabinoid system, well, there's these 2 cannabis-like molecules in the brain. One's called anandamide, the other is called 2-AG. And they're your kind of brain's own cannabis. And they participate in a lot of interesting functions. We're learning from animal studies and also human studies what they do. And, the bottom line is that they're involved in regulating mood, they're involved in regulating appetite, and in your body they do very interesting things. They regulate pain messages, the passage of pain messages to the brain. They're also involved in the regulation of body weight, and there's cannabinoid receptors actually in your fat tissue. So the whole of your fat metabolism seems to be regulated by cannabinoids too. Another very recent finding is that cannabinoid receptors regulate bone density. So there's another very, very important function that these endogenous cannabinoids are involved in. They're everywhere, and they do just about everything. we can produce a special mouse. You can genetically engineer a mouse that's missing the cannabis receptors in its brain. And it's a very interesting mouse. It's more anxious than normal mice. It dies earlier than a normal mouse. It has abnormal metabolism. It's particularly thin. It doesn't have much of an appetite. And its vulnerability to drug abuse is greatly reduced as well. It self-administers less alcohol, self-administers less morphine, and less nicotine as well. So that tells us that, without this cannabinoid system within us, we'd be very different animals indeed. The cannabinoid system does change over time, and one very striking thing is that, you ask the question, who are the major consumers of cannabis in our society? It's overwhelmingly, teenagers and 20-somethings. By the time you're 30 or so, your cannabis career is basically drawing to a close. That goes for a lot of other drugs as well. Certainly from animal studies, we're learning that there's a greater vulnerability to the rewarding effects of cannabis in younger animals. We certainly see that in our rats. Our adolescent rats have a much greater preference for cannabis than adult rats. In fact, if we take grown-up rats, they'll avoid cannabis. They don't really like it very much. So there's some interesting interaction between development and cannabis effects. The other thing that we find is that adolescence, at least in our animal models, is a time of vulnerability in terms of lasting adverse effects of cannabis. So if we give adolescent rats a lot of cannabis during their adolescence and then test them when they're grown up and no longer taking cannabis, we find that their memory is still impaired, we find that they're less sociable, we find that they're more anxious than rats that haven't had cannabis during adolescence. So these are very interesting observations from animal models that suggest there might be a sort of lasting developmental effect of cannabis exposure, such that even if you give up the drug, there's going to kind of lay down a certain program that may last into adulthood and may actually have quite adverse effects.